I'm Caprio. My tent says I'm two people. I'm the Gemini, so I can handle that pretty easily. I have lots of conversations with myself that really make a lot of sense. First, let me say it's a pleasure to be here, and what I'm going to try and go through today is a shortened version of a presentation that I've given a few times. And my goal is to provide you with kind of an overview of the challenges facing municipalities in the state and lead to a couple of things that are involved with the Facing Our Future initiative and some of the best practices that they have identified. On their website, you will find something in the order of about 700 examples of best practices that people can look to. But my message here today is a little bit more, how can I put it, cautionary, because there's a lot of discussion going on about best practices, consolidation, and so on. And my message is, and I'm going to try and do this with some data that I'm going to regrettably go through faster than I would like in recognition of the time and the fact that we have other panelists to get to. But to provide a message that any of these things individually, and in fact even in combination, are probably not sufficient to address the revenue challenges facing municipalities in the state today. And so in doing that, I'm going to just whip through a couple of background issues. First, New Jersey is not the state it used to be with respect to economic development. Pharma is not anywhere near the presence it was, telecommunications, information technology, and so on. So we need to be asking the question, what is the next new major industry that's going to help provide the kinds of jobs at the level, income level, that we historically as a state have assumed to be here. And that is not a given, and it's not a drop-dead simple solution. We also are suffering from the politics of belief over reality. There's a lot of stuff out there about the way it's going to be fixed is to do this and do that. Consolidation, for example, is one topic that's been discussed. The fact is, just because you want it to be a certain way is not going to make it that way, and we have to be looking at fact-based reality. Also, we're suffering from decades of expedient short-term decisions. I think everyone in this room is well aware of that. There's plenty of blame to go around. Let's not worry about the blame. We are where we are. And finally, what we're looking at is the aftermath of the Great Recession, where 2007, 2008 really was a number of things coming together for the perfect economic storm. Some of that will be decided in 2 weeks, some may not. But the fact is, given where we are, the slow recovery, yes, recovery, the fact that there are jobs that are no longer here and are not likely ever to come back, and in fact are not going to be sufficiently replaced by stocking the shelves at Walmart overnight, and with challenges with Chapter 78 reform for health care and pension, and the 2% property tax cap, I would submit that by roughly 2014, 2015, municipalities in the state are going to be facing very serious challenges, and that consolidation, shared services, and any number of other things, including what Mr. Boxer alluded to in terms of trying to eliminate waste and fraud. He was too kind, I think, to admit it. All of that combined is not going to be enough to deal with what we have to face. So, obviously, I've alluded to the three major actions: property tax cap levy, the cost sharing, and interest arbitration. And I'm going to go through a couple. First, I'm going to look at the employee side. Everybody talks about the public employee, the bad guys, bad ladies. They're, consuming all kinds of taxpayer resources. Chapter 78, particularly as it relates to municipalities, essentially cost shifts over a 4-year period, an amount of percentage to the healthcare premium that's to be paid by employees. And if you look at the actual chart that's promulgated by the state, it looks quite progressive. That is to say, people making $30,000 are paying less than people making $100,000. But that's where it stops. So if you're making $100,000, $110,000, and you're liable for 35% of the healthcare premium, you could also be making $250,000 and still be subject to the same 35%. So the charts here are pretty straightforward in that, starting with 2011, where we had 1.5%, then we begin to see the phase-in. If you have single coverage and you're a public employee, by 2015, you'll be contributing approximately almost 6% of your base salary, your 2011 base salary, to healthcare costs. If you have family coverage, you're going to be contributing something close to 10%. Now, that translates into, for tens of thousands of public employees, loss of real income. My observation here is that does nothing more, given the annual increase in the premiums. If you have, as Mr. Boxer said, state health care benefits as your plan, nothing more than a stabilization of what municipalities will pay. And that only stabilizes it for 2 years, effectively state fiscal year 14 and state fiscal year 15, beyond which the increase continues because the employees have maxed out. In the meantime, you have a loss of real discretionary income on the part of hundreds of thousands of public employees. I would submit having probably a recessionary impact, probably reducing the annual growth rate by half a point. Now, the critical thing about this is that not a nickel more was added to the economy as a result of this cost shift. And one would argue that, yes, employees need to be on the same page. I'd be the first one to admit that. Yes, they probably need to contribute to healthcare costs. However, the reform does nothing to provide pressure on the supply side. Moving forward. In addition, we have the real world out there. In the last 2 years, the cumulative increase in the CPI is about 4%. Just keep that in the back of your mind, particularly when we talk about the 2% property tax cap. What we're saying is a lead up with a 4% increase in the CPI over the last 2 years and a 2% annual property tax cap. Municipalities have been able to do nothing more than maintain services at the level they had in 2011, assuming that what they're consuming is at that 4% cumulative point. Let's look at appropriations. Appropriations vary. Some of this is online at the Facing Our Future site. If you look at this, yes, the largest number is 20% for police. The reality is some of this stuff is not fungible. If you have to make decisions on which you're going to appropriate, debt service doesn't change. Your fringe costs don't change. The reserve for uncollected taxes can't be changed. When you look at your average municipal budget, somewhere in the order of a third of the budget cannot be reduced, which means every time you need to cut $1 because of revenue pressures, you need to cut $1.50 everywhere else. So the challenges are considerable. So let's take a quick look at the 2% levy. Okay. Now, municipal budgets are not all that complicated. You've got essentially 5 major revenue sources: property tax, state aid, miscellaneous local revenue, typically from things like hotel tax and so on, UCC monies, delinquent taxes, and then the fund balance. As a result of changes in the environment and changes in state policy as it relates to state aid, proportion of the average New Jersey municipal budget dependent on revenue from the property tax. That proportion has gone from 53% to 60%. Approximately a 13% increase. This chart is showing state aid. And it's like anything. You got 5 revenue sources, one goes down. Simply to maintain what you're doing, something else has got to go up. If you look at state aid from roughly 2001 to 2007, and you ask the question, okay, if state policy were able to extend that into the future, by approximately calendar year 2011, we'd be close to $2 billion in terms of state aid. The blue line shows the actual progression of state aid. What does this mean? We're looking at this with respect to the state aid here. We have a little blimp here in terms of the use of the fund balance. Most municipalities have essentially wiped out what discretion they had in the fund balance. And one can ask the question, just simply to offset the loss in state aid, what percent of the increase in property taxes between 2007 and 2011 were solely attributable to compensating for the loss of state aid? That's 50 cents on a dollar. And for all of you municipal officials out there, you know, you were bad guys, or bad women who just were reckless about having property taxes increase, but the reality is the external pressures were generated by the inability of the state to continue on its trend of state aid to municipalities. If it's not coming from the state, where's it coming from? Since we are so dependent, the facing our future conclusion of this is that if we wanted to maintain steady state services that were available in 2009, we would need to have resources at this particular level. When we factor in the impact of the recession, the 2% property tax cap, and a variety of other issues such as the limited availability of fund balance, we have a serious disconnect here. This represents the amount of resources that are not there to maintain services at past levels, which means we have to find new revenue, find ways of being more efficient, shared services or consolidation, or eliminate the service. Because every municipality, as you know, is required to have a balanced budget. Okay, there was a study done about a year ago by the League of Municipalities and the and Rutgers, which essentially surveyed municipalities and asked them what were the strategies they were looking at with respect to budget shortfalls. This is pretty straightforward. Elimination of positions, freezing vacant positions were critical. Shared service as a recipient. Frequency looks impressive, but shared services as a factor of total budget is less than 0.5%. So everybody's interested in it, but the amount of savings that are likely to be accrued are almost non-existent. Obstacles to shared services. This gets back to some of the stuff that Mark was alluding to. Citizen opposition is one. It was I would share Mark's observation about the study on the Somerset County Consolidated Police Force. It was an exceptionally well done study, but there you have, I think, in one example, the stress that people face. And I asked the question, maybe this is the environment we really want. Maybe this is the environment that we're prepared to pay for. Maybe it's not quite that simple. So, you know, let's look at one or two things. There's a new slide that's in here. Okay. Everyone says bigger is better. It's more efficient. I don't think so. Now, this would suggest that small municipalities are inherently more inefficient. What the chart is, it's the appropriation in each municipality per capita. Okay, this was done for 561 municipalities. If a municipality was less than 100 or more than 100,000, I took them out. In part because I don't think anybody wants to emulate some of the over 100,000 municipalities. So this seems to support the premise that municipalities, if they're really small, under 5,000 roughly, they should go away. You know? Well, you know, except reality gets in the way. If you look at a whole host of municipalities, something around 50 or so, all happen to be like on Long Beach Island or Absecon Island, you find that there's a different picture. In fact, if you take out all of the seasonal communities under 5,000 people, these are all shore communities, LBI communities, Harvey Cedars, Avalon, you name them, Longport, even Atlantic City is in here, but not under the 5,000, obviously. The actual cost goes up from 3,000 to 5,000. And it makes good sense because you have, in effect, an infrastructure that has to support a population that's 4, 5, 6 times larger over a 4-month period than the year-round residents. And so you're never going to get, for those types of communities, efficient government. Oh, and by the way, I challenge any of you to find in the Constitution the word efficient. When you take that out, even municipalities, in terms of the average municipality appropriation per capita, 1441, the range is relatively narrow. My point here is simple. Even if you had 2 communities, like the Princetons, and maybe there might be 1 or 2 such examples throughout the state, you're never going to find the kinds of savings that most municipalities are going to be looking for. Which leads us to the question of, well, okay, what else might there be, say shared services or what have you, which, as I said, you know, represent right now less than 0.5% of total appropriations. Of course, there's also been changes in interest arbitration where the pendulum now has swung the other way. All of this essentially means that by 2014, 2015, there's going to be both labor stress and financial stress. And the solutions require that we look at alternatives. Interestingly, that same study from Rutgers and the League of Municipalities asked the question, you know, what's the best alternative strategies? The one that most municipal leaders have said they would prefer is local government should be able to set and raise revenue from other sources. Now, if you think about that for a second, we do have a problem in terms of property tax. Property tax, we are number 1 in the country, but we also have, in terms of continental U.S., house values that are number 2. And if, in fact, taxes are based on value, we're not that much of a disconnect. However, if you ask the question, what is our tax burden? All the taxes, gas tax, everything else. Depending on which study you read, and I'd be the first one to qualify that all of these studies come from a red perspective or a blue perspective, okay? And the range is somewhere between about we're ranked 10th to 20th. So when you look at the fact that we are probably number 2 income-wise, but ranked somewhere 10 to 20 in terms of total tax burden, it isn't so bad. Where do we go? What are some of the things we need to consider? We are at a point where we have limited fund balance growth. We have miscellaneous revenue tied to a slow recovery. We have state aid growth marginal at best over the next couple of years. All of this is straightforward. Healthcare cost increases are only going to be slightly deferred. There are going to be labor cost pressures that are going to be forthcoming. So we are at a point where we need to begin to consider any number of things. Shared services should be highly encouraged, although I would be the first to stress that the amount of savings are not likely to yield the magnitude that we are really needing and looking to. We have to look at how we enter into service agreement. We are at a point where the real critical question is how do we deliver services in the 21st century? We have a revenue source that was essential, it's probably a couple hundred years old, value on property. The challenge with value on property is that it represents value that you cannot recover until you sell. And in fact, to keep it appropriately reasonable within the constitutional requirements, obviously it has to go up. And so we have to ask the question, is that the most appropriate way? In the meantime, there has to be considerable effort to try and do everything possible to make the kinds of savings that will reduce the size of the problem and the challenge in 2014-2015. I would refer you to the Facing Our Future website. There's lots of stuff up there. I apologize for the last 2 or 3 minutes, but it's a ghost of Matt's comments about community college presidents. I'm sure that's what it did. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'll pass it on to you.